I'm interested in your thoughts about the stress tests in Europe and across the US, and if they were applied to Asia, because they're saying that without putting in the Greek default story or these factors or putting capital ratio at 7%, they're not really stressful stress tests. So it's fudging the situation.
Well, I guess I'm not sure what went into all of the stress assumptions, but I think what's quite clear is that the Asian situation for most Asian countries is quite different. If you look at most of the Southeast Asian banks, and Singaporean banks are an example, we've been running core tier 1 north of 11% for the entire decade. And that's true for many Asian countries that were impacted by the crisis. And therefore, no matter what level of stress you put into the system, most of the Asian players can quite handily address those stress situations.
Is it because of the crisis that happened, therefore you are far more
absolutely.
watchful?
I think the 98-99 Asian crisis had profound implications for not just the regulators, but also the banks themselves in Asia. Because most banks really geared up and really capitalized themselves very strongly. Now, obviously, the Japanese are a little bit of an exception to that. And you could argue that the book value of some of the Chinese banks is questionable. But by and large, Asian banks are really very strongly capitalized. So the Basel III implications are really not very onerous for most Asian countries.
The word questionable, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's what
let's pick up on that one, yes.
In what way they're questionable, and name and shame them as well.
Well, I have no intention or capacity to name and shame. But if you think about the issue around the local government financing vehicles, right, and there's clearly a big issue out there. Order of magnitude, the Chinese banks put on roughly $2 trillion of loans in a 2-year period. That's a lot of loans. And if you reckon that anything from 10-20% of them were into unproductive investment, there's potentially $300 billion of assets which are probably unproductive, which means at some stage, somewhere along the line, those will probably have to come out of the tangible book values of these banks. Now, the good news is the Chinese banks were in worse shape 10 years ago, right? But China as a country has the capacity to be able to absorb those kinds of numbers.
Yeah, but this is what I think Susan and I were talking about the other day, which is that, well, these are local debt, which is on the balance sheets of these banks, which in turn are partly state-owned. So in the end, the state will just effectively bail out the local governments, and that creates, of course, well, moral hazard, doesn't it?
Well, it does, but you think about it. In the U.S., when the government wrote a $700 billion check for TARP, right, now the money came back, but they were willing to write $700 billion to bail out the system. This is not different. So it's a $300 billion check which is needed. It doesn't have to go in the form of a TARP. It can go in through different channels. But at the end of the day, if the government can step up and hold $700 billion, then the Chinese government can pretty much absorb a $300 billion hit if it comes to that.
Okay, so given these assumptions, then you were talking about Chinese growth being unabated at this point. How is DBS, I guess, planning for the future, if this is what you think of the banking system in China?
If you think medium term, I would bet on China. And so, frankly, our whole growth prospects in Asia are yoked very firmly to China, India, Indonesia, all the large Asian economies. We think Asia will power through. In the short term, there is uncertainty because I think inflation at 6.5% is a serious issue in China. I think some of the implications of this, local government financing vehicles in the short term could create a bouncy ride. And so there's no question the second half of the year will be slow. But if you think 3, 5, 10 years out, it's a good bet to make.
Yeah, you talked about Indonesia. I actually wanted to bring that up because DBS, you have a significant amount of wealth management clients. And for a while, DBS was among the banks that weren't allowed to be adding these wealth management clients in Indonesia. I believe that's been lifted for DBS itself. Is that right?
Well, that's true. What they did is they put a freeze for a month on everybody in the system.
Right.
And then they had auditors go in and audit each of the bank branches. And as you got the branches audited, then they let you get back to adding clients.
But I believe Citi has been banned from adding wealth management clients.
Yeah, that's
a special situation.
But you used to work
else,
for Citi, so what do you think of that situation in terms of what Indonesia is doing to I guess, clamp down on Citi in different formats?
Right, I'm not sure I want to comment on a specific situation with a specific bank, but it's quite clear that across the region, one of the outcomes of the 2008 crisis, and particularly the Lehman collapse, has been that regulators have got a lot more finicky about the sale of wealth management products in general, and certainly to what's called the mass affluent segment. And therefore, it really behoves most players, of their own accord, as well as pushed by regulators, to try and make sure that you're pretty pipsqueak spotty clean in terms of how you address these markets.
I'm going to ask you mentioned that China inflation 6.5% is a worry, a serious issue. What's the growth story of choice? Is it India or is it China?
Frankly, I think it's both. Because if you think
can't
about
say that, that's not fair.
Well, the thing is, both countries have one common feature, and which is what Keynes called animal spirits. So if you go down to the animal spirits issue and you go and talk to the man on the street or the SME or the entrepreneur in both countries, you get a very comparable response, which is that people are optimistic, people are investing, and people are investing in growth. And to me, that's going to be the principal driver of both the economies. Frankly, all three. Indonesia
Well, the Chinese
is the same
debt
story.
issue is there. India hasn't got that as much.
So India doesn't have that, but India has an issue
Red tape
and corruption,
infrastructure.
And there are no policy decisions being made over the last 12, 18 months. At least they're slow, and so each country has its own sets of issues to grapple with. To me, the underlying driver for all of these countries across Asia is really going to be consumption demand. As if effectively Asia is changing from what it used to be, a producing Asia, to becoming a consuming Asia. And the consuming Asia story transcends all of the political and governmental and bureaucratic impediments.
Piyush Gupta, though, is there enough to go around? We're talking about over 2 billion people here. If they start to eat in the same sort of quantities as the developed nations, we've got a serious crisis on our hands. And I suppose it's what Jim Rogers says, isn't it? Jim Rogers saying it's going to be all the farmers driving around in Ferraris as a result.
Well, I think there is a case to make. I think there will be a resources constraint in the physical space, and which is why Jim Rogers is such a commodity bull. I think there is some elements of that for sure. But if you think longer term, as opposed to short-term cycles, then you have to posit that it's, whatever it is, 2 billion odd people coming into the consumption stream, and a huge investment drive as these regions start to put in infrastructure which has been long overdue. There's clearly no paucity of demand. So to me, it will be a supply-side story.